Welcome to a special episode of the Voice of San Diego podcast. I'm Sarah Libby.
I'm Rivard.
What's up, Rye?
Not much. How's it going, Sarah?
It's going pretty well.
Let's do this.
So, on Saturday at PolitiFest, Rye and I did a rundown of all 12 state ballot measures. It's sort of 12, sort of 11.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
We will. So if you weren't able to make it, good news. Here we are doing it for you on the podcast.
Pithy and hopefully well.
I hope so, yeah. So let's run down some basics before we dive into the sort of 11, sort of 12 ballot measures. First of all, we're talking about the state measures. So those are called propositions. So anytime you hear about Proposition 1, Proposition 9, those are statewide measures that everyone in California gets to vote on. Measures are referring to county, local, those local smaller government
city,
entity
county,
measures,
school districts,
school bonds.
special districts.
Exactly. When's the election?
November 6th.
That's right.
Tuesday,
November 6th. Mark it. You can vote early if you're a vote by mail person. All right. So several of the measures that we're going to talk about are really super sexy general obligation bonds. So, Rye, explain what that is.
That allows the state to borrow money and pay it back over the next several decades, usually 30 years, sometimes 45, sometimes a little bit shorter, sometimes a little bit longer. And the difference between borrowing and sort of setting stuff aside for the future and what we'll call general fund money or budget money is the budget money that isn't otherwise obligated, and the budget can sort of be spent on whatever you got going on that year. But when you've borrowed a general obligation bond, you're essentially dedicating part of the budget for years to come to paying off bonds, paying off the debt for stuff that, presumably you're building right now.
Yeah, and most of these, I think, have a payback period of about 30 or 35 years. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're talking about millions of dollars every year for 35 years, for the most part. All right.
The state budget is over $100 billion for some kind of context.
Great. Let's do it.
Proposition 1 is a housing and veterans loans bond. It is one of several housing-related bonds that we're going to be talking about today. It's also one of several housing-related pieces of legislation that the legislature has been dealing with. They put it on the ballot as a proposition this year. And the reason for this is pretty simple. Everybody, I think, acknowledges that there's a housing shortage, even a housing crisis in California. And this would allow the state to borrow $4 billion to deal with some of that, to house about 55,000 people in one form or another. It would cost about $170 million a year to pay back over the next several decades. That's 0.1% of the state budget, which is, as we said, pretty big. $1 billion of this is for veterans to buy homes, and these are home loans. So there's actually an assumption that $1 billion will pay for itself because the veterans will take out loans and then pay them back. Then there's another $1.8 billion to build and preserve rental units for low-income people. Low income is about 60% of the median income, which is roughly a family of four living on $60,000 a year here. There's also $450 million to build housing and housing infrastructure in urban areas and areas near transit. There's $450 million also to encourage home ownership for low and moderate income people doing a little bit better, and $300 million to build housing for farm workers. Typically, you'll see farm workers up in the Central Valley, although we have some here in San Diego. They don't make a whole lot of money, as you can imagine, and so finding suitable housing is somewhat difficult. This doesn't help everybody, of course, but it helps. Estimates show 30,000 renters, 7,500 farm workers, 15,000 home buyers, and 3,000 veterans. And that's that. That's people say we need it because it'll help that many people find a home.
All right. So opponents say basically that it will only generate kind of a small blip in new housing construction, and therefore it's not, worth all the debt that the state will take on. The Riverside Press Enterprise, its editorial board came out and said that more money might not be the answer, and instead, we should be slashing regulations that make it harder to build. Some of the opponents include John Cox, the Republican candidate for governor, and the Republican Party. All right, Prop 2 is also a bond related to housing, but this one's a little bit different. So several years ago, voters approved a tax on millionaires. This was back in 2004, and it was meant to fund services for the mentally ill. And then we re-upped that tax back in 2016, and the idea for that was to spend some of the money on supportive housing for the mentally ill. That plan has been held up because some opponents sued over the use of that money. They said that supportive housing is not how we should be using that tax money, and that it was supposed to go only towards services. And so all that money has been held up in a lawsuit, and counties are just sort of sitting on millions and millions of dollars that they're afraid to spend. So the legislature said, let's put this on the ballot, get voters to okay directly the use of that money on supportive housing. So the idea is just that with voters giving an affirmative yes to spending the money this way, the state can borrow $2 billion in funds that it would pay back using that millionaire's tax extension. The argument's pretty simple. Supporters say supportive housing is the best way to reduce homelessness among the chronically mentally ill. The state Democratic Party, the Chamber of Commerce, a lot of local leaders from San Diego on both sides of the aisle have endorsed this. That includes Tony Atkins, Todd Gloria, Myrtle Cole, Brian Mainshine. The California Association of Counties is a supporter. Remember, counties are just sitting on a lot of this money that they're kind of afraid to spend lest they maybe be sued.
The opposition to Proposition 2 is fairly limited. There's, in fact, not much of it. But the criticism out there is that voters knew what they were doing when they set aside this money for mental health services, and they wanted services for people with mental health issues, not housing, and those are two different things. And the intent of the voters was to do one thing, not the other, and this bond sort of overrides the previous bond language. One named opponent is the Contra Costa chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They said it's difficult if this money gets set aside for housing. It's actually difficult to build housing units for mentally ill people. And so if we think we're going to suddenly be able to build that sort of housing, it's actually going to get opposed by NIMBYs and other groups that don't want these kind of facilities in their neighborhood. And the money should instead be spent now on services rather than on housing that may not get built anytime soon or ever. Proposition 3 is a water bond. It's if that sounds familiar, we passed a water bond in June. That was a $4.1 billion water bond. We also passed another water bond several years ago in 2014. That was a $7.5 billion water bond. This November's water bond is an $8.8 billion water bond. It'll cost about $430 million a year to pay back, and this will be over the next 40 years. The biggest chunk of this money is $2.5 billion that will go to protect, restore, and improve, quote, watershed lands in specific areas of the state.
What's a watershed land?
It's a pretty nebulous term. It's a place where there's a watershed.
Mm-hmm, sure.
And a watershed is essentially an area where water drains through it. And every area is divided into a watershed. And so one could imagine that everything is a watershed. But there's specifically some money set aside for watershed lands in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. And one that would be interesting for San Diegans is there's supposedly a $200 million from this that'll go to help the Salton Sea, which is a sort of watershedy land out in Imperial County. And what's interesting about the Salton Sea is that part of the reason that it's become an issue, part of the reason it's drying up, part of the reason that dust is feared to be going into the air, a sort of toxic mixture of dust. There's some debate about how toxic it is, but that there's dust coming up from the sea as it dries up is that much of the water that used to be used in Imperial County for farming in the Imperial Valley is now coming to San Diego because we signed a deal about 15 years ago to get a lot of water from farmers out there. And so San Diego is one of the reasons it's drying up. Our water supply is doing that. And this would go to sort of alleviate some of the concerns about the sea becoming dangerous. And if that doesn't happen, some farmers out there have threatened to blow up this water deal. And so this is an interesting way of having the state fund part of a problem that San Diego has at very least contributed to. There's also $750 million in here for repairs to federally owned water projects in the Central Valley. The federal government, in theory, owns and should be maintaining this water system, but this would direct state money to that. Of course, these are California farmers, so maybe it doesn't matter if you think the federal government should be paying or not. The supporters of this include John Cox and Dianne Feinstein.
Say what?
Yeah, so John Cox, obviously the Republican for governor, Dianne Feinstein, obviously the Democratic senator. They seem to both be interested in getting the votes of Central Valley farmers.
There it is.
Yeah. And the League of Cities, the Chamber of Commerce, and Ducks Unlimited are also supporters.
That big Ducks Unlimited vote. Next time somebody asks me what the Salton Sea is, I'm going to say, obviously, it's a sort of watershed.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's great.
So opponents say that there is still a lot of unspent money from the 2014 water bond. Also, they say that the list of projects this would fund includes some regional projects that typically are paid for by local water agencies. So, voters statewide would be paying for these. And finally, they say it doubles down on environmentally unfriendly projects like big dams. And in fact, a big environmental group is the leading opponent, the Sierra Club of California. All right, Prop 4 for a fun change is another bond.
But for sick kids.
This one is for sick kids, so this would authorize $1.5 billion in bonds to expand and renovate California's children's hospitals. It would cost about $80 million a year for 35 years. Now, the money is broken up into sort of three chunks, and by far the biggest chunk, 72%, would go to a group of 8 nonprofit children's hospitals. That group does include Rady's here in San Diego.
Ooh.
There you go. Another 18% would go to a group of 5 UC hospitals. I have a weird point to mention on that in a second. And then the final 10% would go to other public and private hospitals, for children's issues or programs. Hospitals naturally are big fans of this measure. Rady's alone has spent more than $1 million supporting it. The state did approve children's hospital bonds in 2004 and 2008 and it still has about $30 billion in unissued bonds still from those measures. So I want to go back to that 18% chunk that goes to the 5 UC hospitals.
Why is that interesting?
So it sent me down this weird wormhole that I roped Rye into over the last couple of weeks because the ballot measure actually spells out what those 5 UC hospitals that would get the money are. And one of those hospitals is the UC San Diego Children's Hospital. Now, I've been living here for 6 years now. I have a baby who has used a children's hospital, and I've never heard of UC San Diego Children's Hospital. And the reason I've never heard of UC San Diego Children's Hospital is because it does not exist. And there's another hospital in this group in Orange County that also does not exist. Orange County is served by the Children's Hospital of Orange County, which is one of those private entities that's in a different pot of money. So, Ryan and I have made some calls, asked around, like, why does this list UC San Diego Children's Hospital? What is this about? And people, I think, told you, correct me if I'm wrong, that essentially just this money would go to UCSD. And it would be for, the things that it partners with Rady's on. It would be for services and programs that serve children. But there is no UC San Diego Children's Hospital. Everybody seems to agree on that.
Yeah, I go for like pediatric care. And they could also partner with Rady's and spend what would between them be $199 million out of this bond, which is a huge chunk of it, really.
Yeah.
Could come to San Diego and be spent jointly by these two entities, Rady's and UCSD.
Yeah, so this one, probably more than any of the other bond measures, kind of sells itself in a way, just because we're talking about such a sympathetic population who's served by the money, and that's sick children. But California hospitals also argue that they often pioneer breakthrough treatments, which means that they end up taking on more and more patients from out of state, maybe even out of the country. And so they say they need this funding to help keep up with all that demand. Supporters include the California Children's Hospital Association, California Teachers Association, the State Democratic Party, and the State Chamber of Commerce.
The arguments that do exist against Proposition 4 are that it benefits the hospitals that are funding the campaign, like Grady's, that a bond measure like this bypasses the spending authority of the legislature, because essentially voters are dictating where the money goes, not the wise and judicious people of the California State Assembly and California State Senate. And then some of this money would go to private hospitals, the smallest chunk of it, I think, but some of it would go to hospitals that are trying to turn a profit. That would be unlike Grady's, which is a nonprofit. Prop 5 is perhaps the most complicated to explain. It would essentially extend part of Proposition 13 to people who are buying new homes if they're seniors or disabled. Prop 13, as you remember, is the 1970s ballot measure proposition that limited property tax increases to 2% a year and also limited how much of the value of a person's home can be taxed. That has held property taxes down artificially for lots of longtime homeowners in California. Say you're a couple, 55 years old, you bought your house 30 years ago, your property taxes have only been allowed to go up 2% a year at most for the past 30 years, even though we know California real estate has become more and more valuable. So you might be living in a home that's worth, say, $600,000, but you're only being taxed on it like it's $200,000. And that has some obvious benefits for the homeowners who, if they're on a fixed income, might have been driven out of their home simply because of property taxes, simply because they picked a good neighborhood to live in decades ago. But it's also done all kinds of things to distort the real estate market. And Prop 5 is an attempt to undo some of that distortion, though arguably it contributes to it. What Prop 5 would do is it would remove what's called a moving penalty these days. So if you're an old, long-time homeowner paying artificially low property taxes and you want to move to a new home, suddenly you're going to have to pay way more taxes because Prop 13 doesn't currently cover new homes. It doesn't protect you from high taxes on a new home. It protects you from higher taxes on a home that you've owned for a long time. So you could say buy a home that's equal in value to the home you have now and end up paying nearly triple the property taxes. What this would do is allow you to take the property tax benefits you've accrued from Prop 13 and transfer it essentially to the new home you're buying. So you'd pay artificially low taxes on that new home too. And that's really the best way to explain it. It's a tax break for seniors who are buying new homes and for disabled people who are buying new homes too. The benefits is it's supposed to sort of help free up some of the old housing stock. I think the ideal use case study for supporters of this would be an older couple who's holding onto their home, their big home that a full family could live in, just because they don't want to pay new property taxes. So these would be empty nesters. Their kids have left. They have a 4 or 5 bedroom house and they don't want to move. This would allow them to move to a new home and pay lower property taxes. You'll hear the opposition to it from Sarah.
Yeah, so opponents say that this just doubles down on tax giveaways to the wealthy. Obviously, a lot of reporting is done over the years about who Prop 13 really benefits.
And by the way, Prop 5 would benefit realtors. They're really in favor of this, realtors and real estate agents.
Yeah, absolutely. And then opponents also say, it could starve the tax base, which schools depend on for a lot of their funding. Opponents include the California Teachers Association, the California Democratic Party, and the Sheriff's Association. Just today, actually, Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez came out with, her list of every measure she supports. And she actually said she supports Prop 5, which puts her in kind of the company of the Republican Party, which is interesting. And she said something along the lines of, it's not perfect, but she does think it will help. All right, Prop 6, buckle up. A lot of these bond measures that we've talked about have supporters and opponents who you might not expect to be on the same sides of issues. You know, we mentioned John Cox and Senator Dianne Feinstein are both in favor of this water bond. Prop 6, I think it's fair to say, is the one that divides most cleanly along partisan lines. It's pretty clear if you support Prop 6, you are a Republican, and if you oppose Prop 6, you are a Democrat. Is that fair?
You might also be a talk radio host.
Absolutely.
Like Carl DeMaio.
So Prop 6, of course, is the gas tax repeal. Along with Prop 10, the rent control measure that we'll talk about in a bit. This is the big blockbuster measure on the ballot. In 2017, lawmakers passed the first gas tax hike in more than 2 decades. The reasoning was kind of twofold. First, the state's roads and infrastructure is just in desperate need of repair. And that's something even Republicans agree on. They just don't agree that this is the right way to address that problem. The other reason behind it is that the gas tax really just doesn't pull in what it used to because of, we have really fuel efficient cars and new technology. Maybe people are driving a bit less. And so all this has sort of led to lawmakers saying that we need to increase the tax so that we're able to keep up with what it brings in. Like I said, Carl DeMaio from San Diego is the leader of the repeal effort. He sort of drove the effort to get this onto the ballot and now is its chief supporter and cheerleader. About $866 million is currently slated for San Diego projects with funding from the gas tax. That includes improvements to roads and highways, to the Otay Mesa Port of Entry, the Blue Line trolley, the 10th Avenue terminal. The state estimates that it could lose about $5 billion a year in expected revenue if the repeal goes through. So arguments in favor of Prop 6 are just that taxes are too high and that the cost of living in California is just not feasible right now. They say that repairs should come from the state's general fund, not from this new tax. And they also argue that there aren't enough safeguards in the gas tax for how the money is spent. So, for example, people like Carl DeMaio have argued that the money from the gas tax should just go to road repairs. They don't think it should be funding other types of transit things like public transit. They also argue that it hits working families harder. Like I said, Carl DeMaio is the chief supporter of this measure. He has a lot of support from John Cox and the state Republican Party and the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association.
So the thing to remember about Prop 6 is that a yes on Prop 6 is a no on the gas tax, and a no on Prop 6 is a yes on the gas tax.
Yes.
So the arguments to keep the gas tax, to vote no on Prop 6, there's sort of one side argument that it is a Republican device crafted to boost Republican turnout in what could otherwise be a blue wave year. But on the merits, the people who are in favor of the gas tax and opposed to Prop 6 point out that the gas tax increase was, 12 cents on the gallon. It was the first tax increase on gas in 23 years. There's billions of dollars in unfunded road repairs. And there are hundreds of dollars in long-term costs that we don't often think about when we're paying more at the pump that we have to deal with if the roads are bad. And if you fix the roads, you have less wear and tear in your car. And some people have said that that's hundreds of dollars a year in value that you simply don't think about when you're paying higher prices at the pump and are freaked out on a short-term basis. The fans of the gas tax include the governor who signed the legislation that enacted it, Lieutenant Governor and Democratic candidate for governor Gavin Newsom, the Chamber of Commerce, which is not usually your first group to raise its hands for more taxes, and the Sierra Club are all fans of the gas tax.
Yeah, I think probably the Chamber's inclusion on that list of opponents probably has something to do with the fact that they estimate there are about 68,000 jobs tied to the projects from the gas tax.
Prop 7 is basically California wanting its own time zone. This would have California have a all-year daylight savings time. Just a reminder what daylight savings time is. We're actually in it right now. The sun rises an hour later than it would on standard time, and of course sets an hour later than it would normally too. That means longer summer days, but also darker mornings. This would make daylight savings, or it would give the legislature the option of making daylight savings time year-round. The arguments for this are sort of convenience. Sarah and I have broken this down into whether you want to be a runner at night or in the morning.
Yes.
If you want to run at night, you like this. If you want to run in the morning, you don't. But then there are also health issues. Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez and some cardiologists wrote statements in support of this. And they said when the time changes, people's sleep cycle gets interrupted, and that increases stroke risk. And of course, the time changes twice a year the way we are now. And it's also a disturbance for anybody that has to get up, and particularly children, readjusting them to a new, it's not a time zone, but a new time pattern is a terrible inconvenience and a health risk.
And opponents, have their own arguments about convenience and health issues as well. So they say that turning the clocks can be annoying, but it will also be annoying when California is on a different time zone than, the rest of the people that we're typically in sync with. They also say that there will be more dark mornings, which could be unsafe for kids, getting them to school and drivers who have commutes. But really, like Rai said, it comes down to personal preference, and that's probably why there's just like weird handfuls of people and groups on both sides of the issue. It's not one of those that breaks cleanly. Opponents include the Sacramento Bee and Mercury News editorial boards.
And even if this thing passes, the legislature still needs to decide. This basically gives the legislature the ability to set daylight savings all year round. And then there's some weird thing with the federal government where they might step in and stop us from doing this anyway. But this just brings it one step closer to all year daylight savings.
All right, Prop 8 is a very weirdly specific measure, and it deals with the profits that dialysis clinics are allowed to make.
What's dialysis?
Dialysis is a medical procedure, and it filters the blood of patients who have kidney issues, so it can be a really critical treatment for a lot of people, help them prolong their lives. It would require clinics to issue rebates to patients or to their insurance providers for revenue that they collect over 115% of the cost of patient care and health improvements. It would also forbid clinics from denying care to patients based on who's paying. So presumably, a clinic couldn't turn you away if you were a Medicare patient, for example. But like most things in California, this is actually really a fight about unions at its heart. So imposing tougher regulations on these dialysis clinics has long been a really big priority for the unions that represent healthcare workers. And then there's also the fact that two of the biggest dialysis clinics in the state, workers have been trying to unionize those two companies for years, and so far they've been unsuccessful. So this is seen as like a attempt to give them a lot more leverage in the fight to unionize those two companies. Are
those companies Big Kidney?
Yeah, this is for Big Kidney. The two companies, this is the argument from supporters. They say that those two big companies that run most of the clinics in California, they're hugely profitable, but they also rack up many health and safety complaints. And so they say that, forcing them to adhere to this would require them to put patients over profits and to make investments in things like equipment and training for workers. The state Democratic Party supports this measure, as does the SEIU United Healthcare Workers.
The arguments against Proposition 8, the main one is that it's hard to regulate profit and cost without being somewhat arbitrary. And so the dialysis clinics, which you can imagine oppose this, are concerned that whatever is enacted cuts into their profits unnecessarily and could also cause them to close, which would threaten the availability of healthcare for people that depend on dialysis. They also, critics of this point out that it is a pressure tactic from unions and therefore should not be supported. Republicans are against this. Dialysis clinics, obviously, as well as the National Kidney Foundation opposes. Proposition 9 is not going to be on the ballot, but had it been, it would have allowed you to vote whether you wanted to divide the state into three. The Supreme Court, I think, mercifully took this took it off the ballot. So that's why there are there is a Prop 12, but there are only 11 propositions. We did come across a proposal, though, to have 3 time zones in the state, which I think is a decent compromise if we're going to still be one state.
RIP 3 Californias. Okay, Prop 10. So along with the gas tax repeal, like I said, I think this is probably the most high-profile measure on the ballot, and it would clear the way toward local jurisdictions creating rent control, rent restrictions, or expanding existing rent control policies. It's important to note that this does not on its own create rent control. It would have to be decided city by city, but Prop 10 would repeal the Costa-Hawkins Act, which set really strict limits on the kinds of rent control measures that cities can implement. So this would just mean that with that gone, cities would be free if they decide to create new rent control policies, and that they wouldn't be strictly limited in what those could be. The costs of this are pretty unclear. That portion of the ballot argument just says we really don't know. So supporters obviously point to the housing crisis and the fact that the cost of living in California has put a lot of families on the brink of homelessness as the reason that this measure is needed. And they just say it's critical to reining in the cost of living and to help people from falling into homelessness. Supporters include the State Democratic Party, the California Teachers Association, the California Nurses Association, State Senator Kevin De Leon, who is running for Senate, the Sacramento Bee editorial board, and Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez.
The arguments against Proposition 10 are essentially that economists generally agree, though they don't agree on much, that rent control doesn't work, that instead it discourages construction of new homes, which is exactly the opposite of what we need now. We need new home construction that'll free up the supply to match the demand, and that rent control will, essentially not allow for profitable construction of new homes and will do worse things than better. Opposed is the GOP, virtually every real estate and realtors group, the Union Tribune, City Councilwoman Barbara Bree, and the NAACP California Conference.
Yeah, the biggest split, I think, for Prop 10 is really among Democrats. Like you said, Republicans are basically universally opposed to rent control, but a lot of Democrats have landed on both sides of this issue. So that seems to be where the main, contentiousness of this one comes from, which is pretty interesting. Barbara Bree, a Democrat, says she opposes Prop 10. Lorena Gonzalez, a Democrat, is in favor of it. And then there are some Democrats who think this is just so spicy that they have stayed out altogether. That includes Tony Atkins and Todd Gloria.
A really good take, I thought, was at PolitiFest last week. Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg talked about how he is opposed to permanent rent control, so permanently suppressing rental prices, but he could be in favor of some kind of temporary rent control, short-term rent controls, to allow the housing stock to catch up with demand. So, holding down prices until new homes can be built that would be more affordable, so that, prices aren't spiking and driving people out of their rentals like they have been across California for years now. And I thought that was an interesting pro argument. It was like you can maybe not want permanent rent control, but want cities to experiment with different kinds.
Yeah, exactly. And I think he said that he actually proposed a version of that. And even just that really temporary limited rent control, he said, was very contentious. So it's something that's, a really divisive issue.
Proposition 11 would require private sector EMS ambulance crews to remain on call during their meal breaks and other breaks. This comes out of a court case that applied to private security guards. The private security guards said, hey, we don't want to have to be on call during our meal breaks and during other breaks. And the court said, hey, actually, labor law supports it. You don't need to be on call. And now private ambulance companies, which actually provide services in most parts of the state, are concerned, and they're facing, I think, litigation from their crews that say, hey, we want, the same privileges. We don't want to have to be on call. So this would make EMS crews for private ambulance companies be on call all the time while they're working. Not, so if they're eating a sandwich and an emergency call comes in, they can't say, hey, I'm on my break, don't need to answer this call. The supporters of this say it's sort of obvious why this is a good idea. You shouldn't be able to not respond to a heart attack because you happen to be having a lunch. And there are some estimates that it could drive down costs to localities, which would otherwise go up if private ambulance companies had to pay more for labor costs.
So there's no official argument against this one on the ballot. If you look through your voter guide, there's just essentially a blank page that says no argument was submitted for this one. But there are opponents, and they essentially just say that it's just a special carve out for a specific industry and that, we should abide by the Supreme Court ruling. Opponents include the California Democratic Party and the California Teachers Association. All right, Prop 12, we made it.
Whoop.
This is one of, I think, the lesser known measures on the ballot, and I think it was also maybe the last one to qualify, so it just barely got in at the end. And this one would set new standards for how farmers are allowed to confine calves raised for veal, pigs raised for pork, and egg-laying hens. Voters did approve a similar measure in 2008. This one's a little different in that it lays out specific standards for the amount of space that each animal should be allowed to have. So calves would have 43 square feet of floor space. That would be the minimum to confine a calf. 24 square feet for pigs and 1 square foot for chickens. So they essentially just have to be able to move around, be able to turn around in their cage. And this measure would also make the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Public Health responsible for enforcement. The legislative analyst has predicted that it could slightly decrease revenue for farmers, and that it could cost up to $10 million for that new enforcement mechanism. So supporters say that there's, the obvious case for this, which is that we shouldn't treat animals cruelly and confine them in really tiny spaces. And they also say there's a public health benefit because diseases like salmonella can fester when an animal is stuck in like a cramped, dirty cage. Supporters include several animal rights groups. I think the National Humane Society is responsible for writing this measure. The Encinitas City Council supports this measure. Encinitas is home to some small boutique farms.
The opponents of Proposition 12 are an interesting coalition. The Farm Bureau is opposed for sort of obvious reasons. It would make farmers do things that they otherwise wouldn't want to do, decreasing efficiency, presumably driving down profit. But the PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, is also opposed, and that seems to come because of an infight within the animal rights community that they have with the Humane Society. They essentially say that the Humane Society, which is an author of Proposition 12, is codifying for at least some period of time the ability of farmers to keep animals in cages, and PETA is a big fan of cage-free. So those are the two basic arguments from farmers and from animal rights groups against Prop 12.
All right. Well, hopefully that sheds a little bit of clarity on what can be sort of an intimidating ballot. It's not as bad as 2016, but, it is kind of hard to wrap your mind around a lot of these like bond measures and really specific industry issues. Our friend Lisa Halverstadt this week has written up a guide to the local measures, not propositions, measures. So, that includes the two competing proposals to redevelop Mission Valley, includes lots of school bonds, pot taxes, how we vote, all kinds of really interesting stuff on the local ballot as well. And so if you, like most people, I assume, are in need of like a study guide or a refresher on those issues, please check that out, voiceofsandiego.org. And good luck out there on November 6th.
Go vote.